Okay, this week is Parsha Shemini, and in this week's Parsha we have the story of the consecration of the Mishkan. As we're going to see in a minute, this is not the first Parsha that deals with the Mishkan or the consecration of the Mishkan. And what we want to explore tonight is this is the only Parsha in the Torah that is named for a number. Shemini means the 8th day. There's no other parsha in the Torah that has a number in it. So there must be something very, very special. So we're going to concentrate on the significance of the number 8 and what happens in the parsha. Later in the parsha, there's a whole section about which animals can be eaten and cannot be eaten. In other words, what's kosher and what's not kosher. What are what are called the simanim, the signs of a kosher animal, a kosher bird, a kosher fish? And what are the signs of not kosher animals, birds, and fish? But the beginning of the parsha is about the consecration of the Mishkan. And then we have a very enigmatic story, which we're going to touch on briefly. It's a huge subject in of itself. For those who have some of my books, I wrote about it extensively in Orchard of Delights and also in Return Again. But we are going to touch on it. And in this incident, on the first day of the service in the Mishkan, so Nadav and Vihu bring an offering that they were not commanded to bring, in other words, in their own initiative. And they literally were consumed, their souls were consumed by a fire from God. And we're gonna touch on that. So let's go back. That why is this parsha called Shemini, on the 8th day? So the procedure for consecrating the Mishkan was for 7 days. They put up the Mishkan and took down the Mishkan, day after day, 7 days. During these 7 days, Moshe served as the high priest, but they didn't do service. There was no service. They just put up the Mishkan and they took it down. On the 8th day, the 8th day is Rosh Chodesh Nisan. For those who have been following this series, we've talked about Rosh Chodesh Nisan a number of times. And on the 8th day is when they put up the Mishkan and it remained standing. And then they began what's called the service, the avoda in the Mishkan. And as part of that service, Nadav and Vihu, on their own initiative, wanted to bring a offering that was not commanded. So here we see that there is a relationship between 7 and 8. In other words, 7 days of preparation to put up the tabernacle, and on the 8th day, they put it up. So throughout Jewish tradition, 7 represents full cycles, full natural cycles. And this is the cycle of 6 days you shall work, and on the 7th day you shall rest. In other words, a week is 7 days. Right now, as you may know, we are counting 7 weeks of, it's called Sfirat Omer, counting the Omer, and as it were, the 8th day is really here the 50th day. In other words, after 7 complete weeks, then there is the 50th day, which is the holiday of Shavuot and the giving of the Torah. So we see that there's a deep relationship between 7 and 8. So one of the most interesting things is, if we go back to the book of Exodus, this is the 8th straight portion that deals directly with the building and the consecration of the Mishkan. 8 straight parshas. 5, the last 5 portions of the book of Exodus, and the first 3 of Leviticus. Next week, a whole new subject is introduced, and the tabernacle is not the main focus. So it's an amazing thing that along with this parsha being named the 8th, because it was on the 8th day that we consecrated the tabernacle, it's also the 8th straight portion that deals with the tabernacle. So there's a midrash that says that when God first told Moshe that Israel should build a tabernacle, so and that God would dwell, as it were, in the Mishkan, as the verse says, Asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. Make for me a holy place, and I will dwell in their midst, which also means in its midst. But the drasha, the symbolic meaning here is it doesn't say in its midst, it says in their midst. So the ultimate goal was for God to dwell in the mind, the heart, the consciousness of each and every person. And the Mishkan was the physical embodiment of that concept. So Moshe says to God, the whole world can't contain you. How can this small, tiny tabernacle be your home? How does that work? How does an infinite God who is beyond all concept and beyond the not only created the physical world, but is also beyond the physical world, how does that work that infinite can dwell in finite? And so this is the secret. This was the secret of what the Ari taught us about creation. That before creation, there was no time, there was no space, there was only the infinite light of God. But in order to create a finite universe that would be, as it were, separate or have its own identity, its own consciousness, God had to contract his infinite being to make place for the world. This is a very fundamental concept in Kabbalah and Hasidut. And so that is the secret of how is it that God is going to dwell in the Mishkan, is the secret of what's called God contracting his infinite being in order to be enclosed within a physical material reality. Now, this is very, very connected to the end of the holiday of Pesach. The portion of Shemini always comes either right before or right after Pesach. And the last day of Pesach is called Shvi'i Shel Pesach, the 7th day of Pesach. And on that day is the whole miracle of crossing the sea. And when we crossed the sea, we began to sing a song. And that song begins, Az Yashir Moshe B'nai Yisrael. And then, and take notice that the verb is actually in the future tense, even though it's describing something that already happened. The Torah is like the narrator telling us they sang after the miracle, but it's in the grammar, it's Az Yashir, they will sing. So the word Az then is Aleph and Zion. Zion equals 7, and Aleph equals 1. So this is the secret of how an infinite God, not just with the tabernacle, but in general, how an infinite God that surrounds all worlds, but at the same time is paradoxically present and manifest in the physical world. And that's represented by Az Yashir. And then they will sing. So this also tells us something beautiful about music, that music has the ability to transcend our normative consciousness, the normative consciousness of the physical material world, and to reach transcendental heights. So now let's take what we said, and we're going to bring up the whole incident with Nadav and Vihu. It's clear that they did something not correct here. The Torah says clearly that they brought an offering that they were not commanded to do. And as a result, in their great enthusiasm, they literally, their souls were consumed. So the rabbis offer many, many different reasons from the text and from tradition. Some say it was because they had drank wine, and you're not, a Kohen is not allowed to drink wine and do the service. Others say it's because they didn't marry, that there was something egotistical about them, that they felt they were above getting married. Others say that they didn't ask their father, Aaron, who was a high priest, or their uncle, Moshe, if they should do this thing or not. And they had a certain amount of midrashim where they spoke somewhat arrogantly about their own potential and in relationship to their father and their uncle, Moshe and Aaron. And yet, after they die, Moshe says to Aaron, now I understand that they are greater than you or I. Because Moshe knew somehow that the tabernacle had to be sanctified. And the Torah says that through the deaths of Nadav and Avihu, the tabernacle was sanctified. Now, this is a very complex, deep subject, but I just want to focus on one context here is what's the relationship with the number 8? And that is, what is the motivation in Nadav and Avihu? We're not going to discuss if they did something wrong, what they did wrong, all of that. But what I want to touch upon is, if the whole Parsha is called Shemini, and this incident happened, so there must be a connection. And the connection is explained in Chassidut, that Nadav and Avihu, to the positive, had such a longing to be close to God, had such a love of God, that they temporarily, let's say, went beyond what they should have. But that's some say they knew exactly what they were doing, and they in a sense wanted to merge with the infinite. They wanted to merge with the divine, which is of course a wonderful thing, but our purpose in the world is not to leave the world with a love of God, but to stay in this world. And of course, we have this concept of what's called Kiddush Hashem. But this is a case usually when a Jew is is forced to give up their life for their beliefs. So this is not something that we usually consciously choose to do. It's something that we may accept upon ourselves. And it's it's significant that in a short time begins Yom HaShoah, the day, Holocaust Memorial Day. So it's very, very interesting that we're having this discussion when tonight begins Holocaust Memorial Day. And there we saw millions of people going to their deaths in what's called Kiddush Hashem, that they sanctified God's name. That also is a whole other subject that we simply don't have the time to go into, but I did want to mention it because it's very, very connected to this whole idea. So we see that Nadav and Vihu, their souls, in a sense, wanted to leave their bodies. They wanted to live on a transcendental plane. They wanted to be truly united with God, which is wonderful. But we're supposed to do it in this world, in this body, and in relationship to the physical world. But we see that there's a very, very interesting part of Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, that says there were 10 ongoing miracles in the temple in Jerusalem. And of course, the temple is a prototype of is modeled on the tabernacle. There were 10 miracles happening on a constant basis. In other words, just a few of them, that the altar was outside. And of course, when it rains, it would rain on the altar. One of the miracles is that the fire on the altar, which was kept going 24/7, was never put out. And if anyone's been in a driving rainstorm, it can put out a fire. One of the miracles is, it never put out a fire. Also, we're told that the smoke that came up from the altar, the wind never was able to move it. And this is something that's beyond our concept. And then maybe the most famous one is that on Yom Kippur, the whole Temple Mount was so crowded, but when the high priest would pronounce the 4-letter name of God, which we do not pronounce outside of the temple, and certainly not now, is everyone would bow down. And it was considered a miracle because one minute before, everyone was like stuffed in like sardines. Where did everyone get room to bow down? So we're told that it was miraculous. In other words, the spatial context of the temple, there were things going on that defied logic and defied normative spatial dimensions. And one of them also is the ark. We knew the specific dimensions of the Holy of Holies. We know the specific dimensions of the ark, but the rabbis, to their amazement, is they couldn't figure out how physically the ark fit in the Holy of Holies. So they said that it took up no room. There was like a space warp. It almost sounds like sci-fi. They were told that there was like a space warp where the ark did not take up any physical space. So here we have on the day that the Mishkan is being consecrated, and the whole concept of the Mishkan is this idea of one beyond. Remember, 7 days they put it up and took it down, up and down, and then only on the 8th day did they leave it up and they began the service. So the entire reality of the Mishkan and the service in the Mishkan was to bring us to a higher level. one beyond the physical, material, nature cycles, and get us in touch with a higher reality, a divine reality. And that's really what Nadav and Avihu wanted. So there's a beautiful explanation in Chassidut. As I said, one of the reasons the sages say that perhaps Nadav and Avihu lost their lives is that they had drunk wine. And how do we know this? Is because right after this incident, God comes to Moshe and says, tell the Kohanim that they cannot drink wine when doing the service. So since these two are juxtaposed, so the rabbis learn that perhaps that was the reason. But there's a beautiful explanation, is because the word yayin equals 70. 70 equals the word sod, secret. And it's the word that represents the secret inner dimensions of the Torah, what we now call Kabbalah, the inner teachings, the deep mystical tradition. And so some say they didn't drink physical wine. They were drunk on the mysteries of the Torah. They were drunk on the mysteries of the soul and its connection to the master of the universe. So it's a very beautiful understanding of the level that Nadav and Avihu were on and what they were trying to achieve. So this reminds us of one previous incident. Going back to the book of Exodus, we're told that during the days leading up to the giving of the Torah, at one point God directed Moshe and Aaron's sons and the 70 elders to go up to Mount Sinai. And the Torah says that God gave them a divine vision. And the wording is, and God did not send out his hand, and they ate and they drank, and they had during this vision. So there's actually a division among the rabbis how to interpret this. What does it mean? God did not send out his hand, and they ate and they drank during this vision. So two of the great rabbis, Rashi and Onkelos. Onkelos is the one who wrote the Aramaic translation. So they see this as a great flaw. In other words, God was this incredible vision, and they took it in as they were eating or drinking. And Rashi and Onkelos feels that this was inappropriate. And what it says that God did not send out his hand means that, in a sense, they prove that in a way they didn't deserve such a vision. But God did not want to ruin the giving of the Torah, which would be within a few days. And that, we'll say that payment, that mida keneged mida, that measure for a measure, only occurred on the consecration of the Mishkan. And that's when, in a sense, Nadav and Avihu, as it were, paid the price for eating and drinking during this incredible vision. Now, there's another side to this, excuse me, and that's, I'm sorry, the opinion I just said was Rashi and the Midrash Tanchuma, not Onkelos. Onkelos and Ramban say the exact opposite. And they say that they didn't really eat and drink, but they were able to integrate this vision because they were at such a high level. It was as if they were eating and drinking. In other words, they were able to integrate this transcendental vision and incorporate it within their consciousness. And when it says that God did not send out his hand, meaning that they were able to deal with this, and it was so real to them, it was as if they were eating and drinking. What is eating and drinking? Is taking something from the outside and putting it in our innards. That's what eating is. It's consuming, it's integrating something from the outside. So we're told in the positive that Nadav and Vihu, they were, in a sense, the main characters here. And they wanted a relationship that was beyond all borders, beyond all strictures. Their love for God, they had so much love, but as is explained, they didn't have enough yira. They didn't have enough natural awe and in the face of an infinite God. They became too close in a way. This happens sometimes with parents and children, where parents want to be like best friends with their children, but they're also the parents, and sometimes they have to teach the kids what to do and what not to do. And so many parents get into this bind, and sometimes children forget that even though they are close to their parents, and their parents are very good friends, but there's certain times that a parent is a parent and has to act that way and has to be treated that way. So this is how we can understand Nadav and Avihu as well. So the number, I'm gonna finish with this. The number 8 also has to do with called Brit Milah, covenant. The covenant circumcision is on the 8th day. And we're going to see this next week's Parsha. Next week's Parsha begins with the idea of Brit Milah. So there's a deep connection between this Parsha and the next Parsha. But in language, we also talk about the covenant of marriage, Brit Nisuin, a covenant of marriage. And that's what Nadav and Avihu wanted. They wanted to go beyond looking at God as Lord, Master, Father, Shepherd, Creator. They wanted a relationship, a love relationship, which of course we have. That's also a big part of our tradition. In fact, on Shavuos, it's as if it's a wedding, and the Torah is the ketubah, is the wedding contract. But that's what Nadav and Avihu wanted. They wanted the number 8, Shemini. They wanted to go one beyond. And so we see that there's very, very positive aspects to that. As we'll see in a couple of parshas called Achrei Mot, we're going to revisit Nadav and Avihu. But there's also something negative, not in order here. So we'll end with a blessing that we should always strive for the infinite. We should always strive for the transcendental. Always strive to go farther, deeper, above, beyond. But we always have to keep our feet on the ground. This is the dream of Yaakov, who saw a ladder that was firmly entrenched in the ground, and it reached the heavens. That is a parable, an allegory for a person, that our head, it's very good for it to be in the clouds as long as our feet are on the ground, and our head in the clouds doesn't take us into unrealistic realms, that we're able to juggle having our feet on the ground and our heads in the heavens.